It's exciting. I've got loads of questions, and I think we have lots of questions with from our lovely movers as well. So, but I thought we would just start by really just talking a little bit about a beginner's practice, and just generally laying the scene. If people are new to yoga, what would you advise?
Well, I would advise, first and foremost, keeping an open mind, because I think often our idea of what yoga is versus what it actually is end up being very different. And also often our idea of why we first come to yoga and then what keeps us hooked on yoga is quite different. So I think the thing to remember first and foremost is that yoga is this amazing practice that really can serve us on many different levels. So obviously, and often actually when we're a beginner, many people are first drawn to yoga because of the physical aspect. They might want to get fitter, or they might have some lower back problems and they heard yoga could help, something like that. Or, they feel like, oh, actually, I want to stretch and tone, so they'll come from it from a physical point of view, which is awesome. And then others may have heard about the fact that actually it's an incredible practice for working with our minds and dealing with things like stress or anxiety. And then even better than that, in a way, or alongside that, is that it also can help us work with our emotions. And so actually, when we first approach it, it's maybe starting to be aware of actually what are our intentions initially. What is it? Which part of ourselves do we most want to work on? Or is it that we want all aspects to be worked upon? Because there's now so much yoga out there, so many different classes, so many different styles. I think having a sense of kind of what it is initially you're looking for will help guide you to the right beginning. But I would say that generally, you want to actually start with beginners classes. I think that's a mistake a lot of people make, is that we're not willing to be a beginner. But actually, we learn much better and much quicker if we actually take the time to learn the fundamentals. So I remember when I was living in London, it was one of my favorite things. I would teach beginners courses, because I just think if you can actually really get a solid foundation right from the get-go, you're going to avoid the common mistakes that get made. You're going to really learn how to do the postures well. You're going to learn how to breathe well. You're going to learn how to kind of work with the practice and in response to your own body. The great thing about, a beginner's class or a beginner's course that are very much aimed at beginners is that, they're going to meet your needs. They're going to meet you where you're at,
And in fact, I think beginners courses aren't always that easy. I mean, I've sometimes done beginners classes and I've been practicing for a long time, and I actually find them really challenging sometimes. I find them more challenging than higher level classes sometimes.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because actually I've often had, I've taught beginners classes, and then also I've taught kind of level 1 entry level classes. And I've actually had a lot of, technically more intermediate practitioners saying, oh, I love going back to those level 1 classes because I'm reminded of all the fundamentals that either I've forgotten or I never actually got in the first place. So I actually think, going back to basics and really learning step by step actually really allows you to flourish and not feel lost and not feel overwhelmed. Because I think we forget after years and years of being in a yoga practice that we take so much for granted. But then actually as a beginner, we come into it thinking, what's this strange breathing? What poses are they doing? Why are they speaking both English words and then other words that I don't know? Why are they barefoot? I mean, there's so many things that we assume that is known, but actually once upon a time we were a beginner and we didn't know any of these things. And so I think also, really giving yourself to be put into a place where people are going to explain really clearly to you, this is how we practice, this is the way that we breathe, these are the words that are both in English, these are the words in the original yogic language, Sanskrit, things like that, because then you feel like you're learning as you go along rather than, oh, have I stepped into somewhere that, I don't belong, or wow, there's so much I don't know yet. Whereas little by little, you then learn in a way that feels empowering and exciting and accessible. I think that's really important.
And welcoming as well. I hear the old, which I think we often hear, or people are worried about that. I can't touch my toes, so can I
Yeah.
do yoga? So
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that's the thing is, like I said, it's that idea of what people think yoga is versus actually what it is. And actually, it's like, from my opinion, I think yoga can serve everyone and anyone, irrespective of what their current physical level is, irrespective of how hard they find it to concentrate or how chronic their stress or fatigue or anxiety is. I really do think yoga is such an amazing practice because there are tools, there are levels, there are approaches that really will meet everyone's need. And in my years of teaching, I've really seen it. I've had people. I had a guy who was 92 and he had his first ever yoga class with me, age 92. And, he had lots of things going on in his body that there were restrictions, but we did it. We taught him to breathe. We did yoga in a chair. And at the end, he said, I feel much better. And so it's never too late to begin. It really taught me. And I was very humbled by, wow, imagine being 92 and still trying new things and being open.
amazing. I love that.
Yeah.
And that's actually, I think, that's maybe one of the gifts of yoga as well, as it teaches you to be more open to new experiences, because you never kind of get there with yoga, do you? You don't. It's not like there's this end result that you're aiming for, because you can always explore something new. There's new discovery. So in fact, we're probably all beginners. It's not.
Absolutely. And I think because every day we wake up with a new emotion, with a new feeling in our body, with a new feeling in our mind, so that every day we can use our yoga practice in response to how we're feeling. And so therefore it never gets old. I mean, for me, I'm now, I don't know, 15, 16 years in, and I still find it as fascinating as I did in my very early days, because every day I don't know what I'm going to discover or what it is that I might need. And I also think it has really taught me to listen to actually, what is it that I need? And it's funny you're talking about the beginners, that we're all beginners, because from the Zen tradition, this ancient Japanese tradition, they talk about this concept of the beginner's mind, and that no matter how far along the path you go, you're always trying to come back to this place of this beginner's mind where you're open and you're receptive. And so actually I think there's something very magic about being a beginner, because you're like a sponge. You're so available for learning and discovering and exploring.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the final thing to add to that is that what I'm discovering after having had a very long-standing practice is that my body's changing as well as I'm getting older.
Yeah.
So in fact, there were things I could just pop into my 20s that I can't quite do, despite, and there are other things I can do really easily now. So I guess we are eternal beginners, and I love that concept of beginner's mind as well. I'm just going to say hello to Kathy and Susanna, who've both typed in and said hello to us.
Oh, hi, loves. Thanks for joining us.
And but actually, I think we've probably got a lot of people joining us on Movement for Modern Life at the moment who are completely new to yoga, and we find ourselves in a very interesting position now that we're having to stay at home. We can't go to a yoga studio to join a beginner's course, so they will be learning from the online tutorials. So if people are worried about practicing safely, or if they know if they're doing the postures right, or how to avoid injuries when they are learning without having a teacher stood in front of them, do you have any advice for them?
Well, interestingly, the thing that came to my mind, I was thinking, actually, what's amazing about this is I think a lot of people are probably coming to yoga now as a beginner, in this context, like with Movement for Modern Life, when maybe they wouldn't have the courage to go into a yoga studio. And I also think that when you're at home, there's no one else there, and so you actually lose some of the, what are the people thinking? Do I fit in? So actually, I think that's initially quite a great benefit. And I think, the beauty of being a beginner and taking beginners classes is that they're going to be geared to beginners. So they're going to explain things really clearly. They're going to show things really clearly. And so I think actually, as long as you're just following what the teacher says, and you're just, looking and kind of sensing where your body is and trying your best to kind of match the shape that they're creating, then you're going to be fine. Because also, when we offer a beginner's class or a beginner's course, we're only going to be offering you the postures that we feel are safe and accessible to a beginner's body. And all of us are going to vary slightly, but even if we've had a very athletic life, actually a lot of the postures are going to be new. And so it's going to be really carefully shown step by step. So I think actually, as long as you're kind of paying attention and following carefully, I think you'll be fine. And for me, it's one of the things I say so much in my classes, and I kind of come back to in my own practice, is that if you are breathing calmly and if your face is relaxed, it's very unlikely that you're going to be too deep in a posture. Usually, if you're over efforting, that's when you can get hurt. And so if your breathing is calm and tranquil, if your face is relaxed, that's going to be an indication that you're working at the right level. So it is learning what, the Buddhists call like the kind of middle path, not too hard, not too soft, just, that middle place where you're feeling like, oh, wow, I'm working in ways I didn't know I could work, but not going too far. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there is, in our culture, there's such a tendency to do biggest and best and somehow really over push. And actually, that's a brilliant tip, to tune in with the breath and make sure that if you're not holding your breath and not being able to breathe, then you're probably at a safe place. So we've got Kathy, a comment from Kathy, that's and she says, a big obstacle to beginners is trying to compare, and that this isn't the right thing to do. So in fact, maybe doing it at home is better.
Yeah. And actually, I have to say, I don't think this is just an obstacle for beginners. I think this is our, lovingly, this is our expression of insecurity and ego. And I think even the most advanced practitioners, actually, this is something they struggle with, of being in this comparative mindset. So I think when you start at home by yourself, just for you, I think actually it's a really beautiful place to start, because it actually kind of lays down this solid foundation of this is practice for you. And actually, initially we might think it's about the postures, but in a way, the postures serve a purpose, yes, to bring a strong and flexible body, but ultimately they're there as a way to kind of explore being human and, working with our breath and ultimately making us feel better. I think that should be a parameter. I remember when I first started practicing yoga, and, my teacher at the time, Max Strom, said, judge a practice by how you feel afterwards and the next day, and if it's starting to make you feel better, then that's great. Now, this is not to say that in the early days, you're not going to be like, oh, I haven't felt that muscle for a few years. There may be some of that. But overall, it's like, do you feel a greater sense of well-being? Maybe you sleep better that night. Maybe you notice that you're less anxious, or maybe you notice suddenly that the backache you've been having is less. So I think also, being aware that it's an evolutionary journey as we begin being a yogi, but the more we do it, the generally better health and well-being we tend to feel.
Yeah, and I can remember so clearly in my really early yoga classes, the next day I would always feel taller. So I'd
beautiful.
feel taller. So, and if you had to give some advice to yourself as a beginner, so Lucy now advising Lucy 15, 16 years ago, whenever it was you started, but what would you say?
Well, it's interesting, because actually I think at the time I had the right intuition for following my own advice. That is still my advice to myself and to other people, is that there is a yoga for everyone, and to be patient and try different classes, try different teachers, try different styles, because there is something for everyone. Like I first discovered yoga actually in India, and I was living and working there for about 6-7 months. And so I found a very traditional Indian teacher, but he didn't speak English. I didn't speak Hindi. And so but he was the available teacher there. So I found myself doing it every day. And then at the end of that journey, I was going back to London. I thought, I really fallen in love with yoga, but I'm fairly sure I'm not going to find this in London. And so what I just did is I just tried lots of different classes, and some I thought, oh, that's not for me. And then slowly but surely it began to reveal itself to me what kind of yoga really worked for me. And so I would just say, don't just presume if one class feels, not sure, or that particular teacher doesn't gel with you. Don't think yoga's not for you. Just actually be like, oh, maybe that style's not quite for me, or maybe that teacher and me don't quite have the connection. And I would say, persist until you find it, because there's so much diversity. There's so many amazing teachers on the site, so many amazing different styles. I would just say, try a good few, and there will be a moment, like a little light bulb moment. I remember it to this day. I went to this class actually with one of our teachers, Kate Walker. I went to her class, and just 3/4 of the way through the class, I just had this light bulb moment, and I just was like, this is my yoga. I found my yoga home. And for me, it was a yoga that needed to be not just physical, but it needed to be physical. But it also was a yoga that addressed my mental state and the state of my heart. And with Kate, I just really found like, yes. And it felt like a homecoming. And as soon as I was like, oh, okay, right. So it's like more slow, mindful, breath-led vinyasa. That's right now what suits me. And so then I just dived into it, and it was a really beautiful journey. But I had to go for quite a few classes and try quite a few styles before I got there.
Lovely. And we'll pick up a couple of things. You said things that I want to follow, but we've had a couple of questions.
Oh, great.
So Susanna asks, or Susanna says, I've strained the muscles in my lower back, and she said not doing yoga, but doing something else. And I'm wondering which yoga poses might help. And she's been practicing for about 2.5
years.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, this is very common, like lower back issues is one of the most common issues. So supine twists, lying on your back, hugging your knees into your chest, and then knees over to one side, knees over to the other side, is really a good, safe way to begin to just release out the muscles in the lower back. There's also a pose called, I'll see if I can show you here, is you lie on your back and you hook one ankle over the other knee in like almost like a number 4 shape, and then you hug the knee into your chest. And what that does is it starts to open the outer hips. And we can always post a little picture afterwards of these poses I'm naming if you're not quite sure what they are. But the other thing is sometimes it's the tightness in the backs of the legs, the muscles known as the hamstrings, that can sometimes have a knock-on effect on the lower back. So beginning to do very gentle hamstring opening on the back. So you would just lie on your back with one leg bent, foot on the floor, and then stretch the other leg into the sky, and then interlace your hands around the back of the thigh, or maybe just below the knee, and just work the leg as best you can towards straight. Take a few breaths. And generally, if you work on, releasing the lower back with some little supine twists, a little bit of the outer hips with that kind of, it's called like a supine pigeon, I guess, and then a little bit of hamstring opening, that will begin to release lower back stuff. But it's super common. But yoga is actually incredibly good for helping prevent lower back issues, but also kind of resolve them as well.
So brilliant, thanks. And then Diane is asking for her sister, who isn't on Facebook. So she says that as a beginner, what do you suggest that she can do for downward dog? Because it's difficult because of an arm injury. So I guess just doing that is...
So it's difficult because I kind of almost need more information in terms of like, well, where's the arm injury? But if, for example, it's like a wrist thing, then I would say you could always do downward dog on your forearms. That's one option. If it's an elbow thing, that actually should also be fine, doing downward dog on your forearms. And then what I would say, because actually a lot of beginners, I mean, I remember so clearly how hard I found downward dog for years. I mean, it's an intense posture actually, that we get used to over time, but it gets used a lot. Is that actually just going into it and coming out of it, flowing into it and out of it briefly, maybe holding it for 2 breaths, coming back onto your hands and knees, holding it for 2 breaths, coming back onto your hands and knees, so that slowly but surely you're beginning to build strength. Now, in the case of this lovely lady's sister, it would just, I'd have to know a little bit more information to be definitely sure that I would want her to be practicing downward dog. Sometimes in early stages of injuries, you actually just want to rest. So I know that's a slightly not total answer, but it's the one that I feel has integrity. Oh, okay, it's just below the shoulder, FYI. Okay, so it might be around bicep, tricep, maybe, who knows. So actually then still, I still feel like a forearm downward dog, like what we call dolphin, that potentially could be okay, you know, because it's not so much weight bearing in the shoulder when you've got the forearms down.
And in terms of alternatives to downward dog, if people are really struggling, and
yeah,
so,
well, even like a downward dog with your knees down, with your hips stacked above your knees, so you still got that integrity of the alignment, and then stretching the arms out, so from your upper back it's sloping all the way down to your hands. You're still actually you know, if you're pressing your hands into the ground, hugging your arms towards each other, you're still weight bearing, you're still building strength in your arms and your upper body. And then slowly but surely over time, you might again begin to lift the knees for a little period of time and then lower them back down. But it's a progressive pose, that one, for sure, you know, but an amazing pose as well to persevere with. It has so many benefits.
And I remember, just like you, Lucy, like doing downward dog, and I remember a teacher saying once, and this is a rest position.
Oh yeah.
What?
No, I've had a lot of students. I've had a lot of students tell me that. They were saying, and a teacher told me it was a rest position. It's not a rest position. I hate it. And I think, you know, generally when we first meet postures that we find challenging, we can tend to have like a negative response to it. But I think that's also the beauty of yoga, is it teaches us that often when we find something challenging, initially our knee-jerk reaction is, oh, I don't like it. But actually, certainly in my own journey with yoga, is that I've begun to learn to soften that and actually just let it be a play and exploration. And I also think it's really important for beginners, but for all levels, is to really be kind to yourself during this process, to try and let go of any expectation of needing to progress at any certain rate or expecting your body to be any certain way. Really, this whole practice is an invitation of deep acceptance of like, what's my body like right now, and how can I serve it? So for example, right now I'm 30 weeks pregnant. My yoga practice looks nothing like it did 30 weeks ago. And so each day I'm just having to be like, okay, what does the body want today? What's it capable of? And I think the more you can practice in that kind of kind, compassionate, accepting way, the more likely it's actually going to feel enjoyable. Because I think ultimately we forget that. I do think, even though, you know, there'll be, you know, growing pain some moments, or it'll be challenging at some moments, ultimately we do want this practice to feel nourishing and enjoyable, because otherwise realistically we won't keep coming back to it. It will feel like another chore, and I don't think ideally yoga should be that. It should be this kind of life enhancing practice if possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we can see what's going on in our minds as well when we're really fighting with a posture, because sometimes there's something else, or if you are in pain, there's no point being in genuine pain. And I think this is something else that's quite interesting to explore for beginners, is what's good pain and what's bad pain. So I'm going to open that out as a question.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, the way that I often talk about it is it's the difference between intensity and pain. I generally say any form of pain we want to be avoiding, because it's your body sending you a message, and the body is actually incredibly intelligent. Usually before you get an injury, there are many little warning signs that if we'd paid attention to, we wouldn't have got stuck in, you know? And so I think it is about learning what's intense, because there will be moments when we're beginning to open and stretch the body or strengthen the body in a way that we've never done before, that it's going to feel intense. But the minute that intensity leaps into pain, I think that's when you need to back off. And again, coming back to that reminder of like, can you breathe calmly? Is your face relaxed? Because usually if they are, you can be working with, you know, a good amount of intensity, but still breathe calmly, still have a relaxed face, you know. And I think it's difficult because some people do come from backgrounds or mentalities where there's this idea of no pain, no gain. But I am not of that school. And I generally think yogic philosophy that underpins the whole practice is also not of that. And for some people who kind of come with that, like I've worked with a lot of ex-athletes and ex-dancers for whom they kind of had to push through pain constantly. And so it's almost their journey with yoga has had to be a re-education around, oh, actually, that does feel painful. Actually, I am pushing too hard. And so again, it comes back to that kind of Buddhist idea of like the middle ground. Like I'm not doing no work, but I'm not doing excessive amounts of work. I'm doing just the right amount of work and intensity that allows for growth and allows for transformation.
And that's really skillful, isn't it? That's where skill comes into a yoga practice, is being at that.
And this deep listening, paying attention. I think that's one of the best things yoga's taught me, is to listen to my own body and to pay attention to what my body's been telling me. Because again, I think we can have gone through life accidentally quite disconnected, and we get into rhythms of things rather than going, oh, you know what, my body's tired, so I'm going to go to bed early tonight. Or, oh, actually, I need to eat now, even though maybe it's half an hour before I usually eat. It's that really listening to our body, because it's really intelligent. It will really tell us so much information. The challenge is discerning the difference between what the mind is saying, which sometimes can be very loud and very persuasive, versus what the body is actually saying. So for some of us, you know, and what I find so interesting about yoga, and having begun as a yoga practitioner, is it taught me so much about my personal tendencies. And we all have our tendencies. Some of us naturally are pushers and we always push too hard. Others of us are, you know, comfort zone people and never go near, you know, pushing ourselves. And so as you go on the journey, you start to learn, what are my tendencies? And you try slowly then through the practice to find this place where you're finding this very balanced middle place of, I'm not pushing too much, but I'm working. And I think the challenge for people who are never used to pushing themselves outside of their comfort zone is sometimes they might be in a pose and their body's actually fine, but their mind is saying, I don't like this. This is hard work. And so it's that discernment, that listening to like, oh, actually, my body's fine right now. It's just my mind. Whereas your body will unequivocally tell you, it will start to shake, or your breath will start to go funny. So I think there are definite, your body's very clever. It will tell you what it needs to know. It needs you to know, as long as you're listening.
Yeah, and I'm nodding frantically because I'm one of those that does tell myself stories like, I'm not strong, or I can't do such and such. And then when I try, I'm like, oh, I can. And actually, I think I have now managed to convince myself I'm a lot stronger than I think physically. Just because I hated games at school, blah blah blah, and then I've been doing yoga for years, so I can actually do things that I keep telling myself I can't, but actually I can. So I think that's a piece of advice to people for throughout their yoga practices as well, is just to keep checking in, because things will change.
And I think the beauty of that, and it's certainly been the experience in my own practice, is that, you know, as you go through it, things that at one point weren't accessible and you thought, I'm never going to find downward dog nice. Then after a while, as your body slowly, progressively, calmly, safely opens up, then one day you're suddenly in downward dog and you go, wow, this is actually okay. And it's really empowering, actually, those moments where you're suddenly like, something that I thought was never going to be possible, actually just through calm, quiet, committed dedication has slowly opened itself up to me. But always my body has opened up to me in a slow way. Anytime I've tried to push it or be forceful, it didn't work, you know? And so I think, again, there's such lovely lessons in that And to feel empowered, to suddenly be like, wow, isn't my body can do things I just didn't know it could.
And staying open, because I've had this whole journey with downward dog, so I hated it, then I loved it, and then I went through a phase a couple of years ago was like, it just feels weird, and I was like, how can it feel weird? I've been practicing yoga for over 20 years, and I can't. And then I just made a few adjustments, and of course everything else in my body had changed, so that was it. And then I was like, oh, I love it again. So even if you've been practicing for years, I think we are still always beginners.
And I think actually that's one thing I do definitely want to say, is that even though I've said ideally in the long run you want to enjoy your yoga practice, it's okay to not like poses initially, and it's okay for your yoga practice to bring things up for you. And I remember in the early days, if I heard a teacher talking about the mind and the body connection, I just thought, oh, I don't really know what they're talking about. But then I remember one day a teacher gave the example of, for example, when you stub your toe, usually you don't go, I'm going to have a great day. I stubbed my toe. I feel good. Usually we go, oh, maybe we swear, but we have a mental and emotional reaction to something that physically happened. And that happens to all of us, right? So we know that, but then we forget that truth when we come onto the yoga mat. But it's exactly the same. Sometimes when we're in postures that we're not used to, or we're opening parts of our body that have been closed for many, many years, it can feel uncomfortable, and our inner reaction can be, I don't like this. And I would just really encourage all levels of practitioners, but beginners especially, to allow that process, to not judge it, to actually know, just like when you stub your toe, there's an initial moment of, then you forget about it before you know, and you move on. And that, so I just wanted to say that, because that's certainly been my own journey over the years of realizing it's very normal that this physical practice has effects on my mind, my mood, my emotions. Yeah,
absolutely. We've got a question that Heather wrote in with, which was about her hip flexors. So Heather runs a lot. And she said, what yoga exercises can help with tight
okay
hips?
Well, first of all, for those of you who are listening who are like, hip what? So hip flexors are basically the muscles at the top of the leg where the belly meets, and their job is to, anytime you take a step or you sit or you run or you bicycle, those muscles, the hip flexors, are contracting. So actually it's a really good question, Heather, because the majority, I would say, of the population, the world, have tight hip flexors because many of us spend a lot of time sedentary now, or especially when we do regular activities like bicycling or running, or we even walk a lot, these muscles can get very tight. So basically, anytime a muscle is working a lot, contracting, working, then actually to help it, we want to do the opposite and we want to stretch it. So any what I would call thigh opening stretches, and I'll see if I can even just show you a very simple one standing, is if you stand and you pick one heel up to your bum, and then you slightly draw the tailbone, the bone at the spine, down, and draw your pubic bone up, immediately right here at the top of my thigh, where my hip flexors are, start to stretch. So anything where you're beginning to stretch the fronts of the thighs are really good, basically. So a lunge, for example, when you have one leg, one knee, like one foot out in front of you with the back knee down, and gently allow the pelvis to just melt and soften towards the floor, that's going to really begin to lengthen and open up the front of the thigh and these muscles known as the hip flexors. And I have to say, if you're someone who has a practice like running or bicycling, the more you do it, the more you need to incorporate the opposite, the stretches, to balance it out. So I remember when years ago I first started bicycling became my form of transport in London. And I just suddenly started noticing things in my yoga practice be much harder. And it took a little while for the cogs to click. And then I was like, oh, it's because I'm working these muscles so much more than I used to, but I haven't yet adapted and changed my practice. So as soon as I started to incorporate much more daily thigh hip opening practices, suddenly it got back to normal again. So I think if you're a runner or you bicycle or you do a lot of sedentary sitting, you should be doing thigh stretches, hip flexor stretches on a regular basis. And I have to say, hip flexing stretches don't always feel nice in the moment, but they often do feel nicer afterwards. And again, if you want us to send you like a long list with some pictures of those hip flexor open poses, we can definitely do that for you, Heather.
Great. And we've had a question from Laurel.
Hi, Laurel.
Well. So Laurel gets pain in her knees when she tries lying back in Baddha Konasana, and so she stopped doing it. She was wondering if you have any recommendations or if it's common.
Well, I think, again, I slightly need more information, but I'm going to presume that the pain might be in the outer knee. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that is quite common because actually, more often than not, it's not necessarily an indication of a knee issue so much as tightness in the hip. So basically, our whole body is connected, but especially hip, knee, ankle, they're all connected. So if the hip is tight and we're taking into this big opening for hips, you Baddha Konasana, we have the soles of the feet together, knees wide. If the hip can't go any further, what takes up the slack is the knee. The knee is then kind of compromised. So what I would actually say is if you support your outer thighs with a couple of like cushions or pillows, so the knees are a little bit elevated and the outer thighs and hips are supported, that should hopefully take out some of the discomfort. So then you can still be actively working on opening the hips, but without compromising your knees. That's one of life's challenges. So I hope that helped. Yep. But yeah, keep going. It's an amazing pose. And for many, many people, actually, lying on the back in Baddha Konasana without support under the thighs is not a very nice experience, myself included. Like, even to this day, I can slowly ease into it without support. And it is the outer knee. There you go. So yeah, it's probably more like you need to focus more on your outer hip opening, and then that will start to release any discomfort in the knee.
So any particular other poses?
Pigeon pose. Pigeon pose, or if pigeon pose is still too tricky, the one I actually talked about earlier, where you're lying on the back and you hook the opposite ankle over the opposite knee in like a number 4 shape and hug the knee in. That's going to really get into the outer hip muscles, which for most of us are tight. If you do a lot of sedentary sitting, it's actually called what's known as like glute amnesia, like your buttock muscles basically forget that they exist and get very, very tight. So when we start to stretch them, that then helps open the hips, and it means that then the hip does more of the opening in these externally, they're known as externally rotated poses, and then the knee takes less of the brunt of it, if that makes sense.
And it's something I find very instructive is if you lie on your back and try and get into tree pose without touching your leg that's bending into tree pose, you'll really get a sense of how much rotation you have, and for me it's not very much. So I find that actually doing that really helps.
And I think that's the wonderful thing is that props are amazing, because then it doesn't have to be an all or nothing. It doesn't have to be, well, I can't do this. It's like, well, actually, if you just give a little bit of support to the body, it then feels supported. Then the muscles that have been holding and gripping slowly start to relax, slowly start to stretch. So I'm a big advocate at the right moments of using props as well. And especially as beginner. I mean, I have to say, I did downward dog with my hands on blocks, sometimes 1, but sometimes 2 against a wall so I didn't slip. Probably I'd say for the first 2 years of my practice, but it meant that my body opened up at a much quicker rate than if I had insisted on not using the props. And yeah, my teacher Max just said, you're gonna evolve quicker if you use these props. And so I thought, okay, sure. I didn't know any different, so I just agreed and I tried it, and it worked. And little by little, my body opened up so that I didn't need them anymore. But they were really instrumental in allowing my back to open, my legs to open for downward dog.
And I think that's a great piece of advice there, Lucy, because I think there is some resistance to using props, because I guess we might feel that it's a way of not being as good. So we shouldn't use them because, that's the wimp's way out. But actually, it's the opposite, isn't it? You're strengthening more by using them. You're supporting your body, and as you said, you're evolving faster.
Yeah, you're allowing your body to learn quicker, basically. And I think that's another really important thing as a beginner, is to try to understand that even though you might see the traditional expressions of the shape, we get fixated that, oh, I need to look like that. But the beauty of these poses, and some of the really leading teachers like Iyengar, for example, is that actually there are so many different ways to do these poses that either deepen them or make them a little less deep. And they help us to move through them in a way that is safe, And one of my teachers has a lovely phrase, let the yoga meet you. So rather than trying to fit yourself into yoga and how you think it should look, allow the yoga to adapt to what your needs are. And that will actually allow you more likely to get quicker to the overall pose that you think you should be in, than just by desperately trying to get yourself there when perhaps your body isn't ready yet.
And again, it's that question of where are you desperately trying to get to? Maybe we should all be trying to get to having a little bit more ease in our lives. And so it's not about being able to do a side crow whilst sipping something.
Yeah, I mean,
more about that ease.
I so agree, Raki. And I think, that is a beginner's, but also just a lifelong yoga practitioner's journey of learning humility, trying to see what a racket the ego is that tells you that these poses should look a certain way, or that you should be a certain type of yoga practitioner. I just think ultimately this is a healing practice that is meant to help us feel better in our body and move through the world with greater ease and peace.
Yeah, and actually, it's just to add to that as well, when you said our bodies need to look a certain way, is that our bodies aren't all built the same either, are they? I mean, everyone. So you might just, with some poses, just have bones that aren't long enough to do certain things.
Totally. And I think that's why actually the whole comparison thing is such a fallacy, because what you realize is that someone can have, for example, incredibly open hips, but very tight shoulders. So from one point of the class, if you're doing a hip opener, then the person next to you with deeply open hips, they're way deeper than you. But then suddenly you're doing a shoulder opener, and then suddenly you look and think, oh, they're finding that really challenging. And so each of us have such different things going on in all different parts of our body. And yeah, there's no value. You don't gain anything apart from sapping the joy by comparison, as far as I can tell.
And actually, I think if I had to, as you're talking, I'm just thinking, if I had to pinpoint the biggest lesson I think I've learned from yoga, it's that don't compare yourself. And that was one I learned really early, and even now I try not to do it. And I found that when I do it, I feel deeply miserable. So I think it's just better not to go there.
Yeah.
So Heather has said thank you. She thinks that's fabulous advice on the hip flexors, but she also wonders, because she said she's been running for many years, and just wondering if I've overdone it with gardening, lots of digging and bending over and shortening her hip flexors. So
yes, I have to say, like, it's funny. I don't have a garden right now because I live in Madrid, but I did have a garden in London, and when I first started gardening, I could not believe how tired my body was. And there are very certain postures you're in for long hours, sustained long hours. And you get, I think gardening's so involved that time sort of warps. But I think, Heather, that very well could also be a little bit of a likely culprit. So again, if you have a big gardening session, I would say at the end of it, even if you did 5 to 10 minutes where you try and lengthen and release some of the work that your lovely hip flexors have been doing, don't give up the gardening, because I think it's just an utterly joyous, wonderful thing to do. But just, balance it out by a little more hip flexing, stretching.
Brilliant. I had a question for people that are starting a home practice. Well, it's kind of been thrust upon us now, hasn't it? That we're all doing a home practice now. What are your top tips for a home practice?
My top tips for home practice, and again, I think this is something that even very established practitioners actually have quite a hard time establishing, is that continuity and routine actually really help. And expect that there is going to be resistance in the mind, but just roll your mat out and get on the mat. Even if your intention is, I'm going to do 5 minutes, it almost never ends up being 5 minutes, but actually get on the mat. Just roll your mat out, have it there staring at you, and then just get on your mat and start moving. And again, especially if we're beginners, we think, well, I don't know what to do. And, just very simple things like all fours, a couple of cat cows, breathing, and just there's no right or wrong way to do it. But I think if you can, get on your mat, and, there is something to be said for doing it at the same time of day. That does kind of start to create this rhythm and this pattern of like, oh, I know I'm doing it. With that being said, don't let that be an excuse. If on one day you can't do it in the morning, but you've got time in the afternoon, then just do it in the afternoon. I would say that there are slight differences depending on the time of day. Often, starting your day with yoga in the morning is amazing. However, because we've been asleep and in one position all night, we do tend to be a little bit stiffer in the morning. So maybe beginners actually might find it more pleasurable to do it at the end of the day when they're feeling a little more open. And so I would say just experiment what feels good and what works for you. And I think the thing is I've felt resistance. I do still some days think, oh, I'm not sure I could be bothered, but I never regret it. I never think, oh, I wish I hadn't done that, because I always feel better. I always, like you, I feel taller. I feel like, I've released some of the tension in my body and my mind. And so just, and even as little as 5 minutes a day will have a profound effect. So again, I think sometimes the mind thinks, well, no, it's got to be full 60 minutes or it's got to be this amount of time. But actually, no, little and often, and they've proved this actually, they said they've done scientific studies into, is it better to do, say, even like 3 90-minute classes a week, or is it actually better to do 15 minutes every single day? And actually what they've proven is that little and often, more regularly, actually does way better for you, your muscles, your joints, your evolution of the practice, than just a couple of times in really long, intense blasts. So I would say those would be my kind of go-to beginner tips for a daily practice.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I think that tip, the 5 minutes, it has to be 90 minutes. It doesn't, because
no.
And I don't know where that came from either, because I've not read that in any ancient yogic text. You must do 90 minutes.
And I think it's about adapting. Like, in the last 2 and a bit years, I became a mother. And so the time I have to commit to my yoga practice is not the same as it used to be. And in the beginning, I was a bit like, oh, I don't know. I don't quite know how to navigate this. And then I just realized my body wants to do yoga. Whatever time you have, even if it's 5 minutes, invest and indulge yourself in that, basically. And then the other thing I often say, which I've used for myself, is that they again have done some studies into 21 days being this magic number. And so sometimes, we can work with the way that our mind and ego works and actually use that to our benefit. So I'm stubborn. And so if I commit to something, I usually don't like to not finish it. So if I want to begin something new, a new habit in my life, I just commit to, I'm going to, sit down and meditate for 5 minutes every day for 21 days, or I'm going to do 5 minutes on my mat for 21 days. And then even, write it on a piece of paper where you tick it off. It feels in a way like childish, but actually it works. And at the end of the 21 days, you have got into a rhythm. You have got used to, oh, I feel better when I do it. And then it's quite easy to then carry on from that 21-day commitment. So that's also, I think, in lockdown, that's quite a nice thing to pass. I got an invitation by a good friend of mine at the beginning of being in quarantine in Madrid, which was early March. And it was a 21-day meditation challenge. And I did that. And I loved it. And I thought, I want to keep going. So then I found another 21-day challenge. And now actually I think, oh, wow, I filled my time with something that feels really good to me, that I've committed to. And again, 5 minutes, anyone can do 5 minutes. The mind will find it hard, although it will try to persuade you that you can't do 5 minutes a day.
I know, it's amazing how often the mind goes, you don't have 5 minutes. And yet you can spend 5 minutes scrolling.
Yeah, just cut out 5 minutes of scrolling and suddenly a lot comes available to you in life.
Yeah, the great advice. And Kat's posted a comment and she says, great advice, Lucy, love that. Little and often works best for me, for sure. So absolutely.
And also I think it feels less hard because often if you have days and days between practice, you kind of spend half the practice getting back into your body. Whereas if you had just done it the day before, even if it was 5 minutes, it flows easier, I find, especially if you're newer.
And then the other thing is, a practice doesn't have to look exactly the same every day, does it? Our bodies change. It might be that you want to breathe more, and even if you do some breathing, as long as it's mindful, maybe a couple of shapes. You don't have to do a prescribed practice.
No, and I think, in the bigger scheme of things, and this is maybe a whole nother conversation, but actually yoga is so much bigger than just the physical postures. Like you said, breathing is yoga, sitting quietly, contemplating is yoga, being mindful is yoga, saying mantras there's so many different expressions of yoga. Lying on your back in shavasana for 5 minutes in corpse pose is yoga. So I think, again, trying to be open about what a practice looks like, and if it's really in response to how you feel that day, it will be like that. Like, again, having become a mother, there were some days where doing one restorative pose for 15 minutes whilst breathing mindfully was absolutely the perfect practice I needed. Any more than that, and it would have fatigued me, and that wouldn't have been the point. And then on other days, all I needed to do was open my shoulders and do some cat cows and some down dogs. So I think giving yourself permission for it to be whatever your body wants it to be, but start from that place of listening.
Yeah, brilliant. I think we're more or less coming to the end of our time. I've got one last question about a physical posture. Is that sitting cross-legged is something that a lot of people find really, really difficult. So what advice do you have for people, particularly for beginners that are struggling?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think this is very common. So again, really sitting cross-legged is actually quite hard, especially if we're not used to sitting like that. It requires quite a lot of opening in the hips and the lower back. So the first thing I would say is use props. What the main kind of alignment principle when you sit cross-legged is you want your hips higher than your knees. And often when we're beginners, our knees are very, very high, and we're having to hold ourselves with all of our back muscles, and it can feel very uncomfortable. So I would say the first thing we would do is to elevate the buttocks as high as you need to get your knees and your hips are at least the same height. So that might be, 3 or 4 stiff, sturdy cushions, because then what will happen is there'll be less gripping in the back and the hips. And then slowly, and especially if you can get your hips even slightly higher than the knees, then the muscles in the hips and the thighs will start to relax under gravity. And slowly that will actually allow your hips to open. And again, little by little, you'll find, 1 month in, I only needed 3 cushions in. 3 months in, 2 cushions in. And then the other thing I would say is, do notice we almost all have a tendency, I always cross my legs with my right leg in front. And so I would encourage you to try and practice, relatively frequently with the opposite one in front. And same thing, just start small increments. Make sure you've got the props if you need them. And then maybe just try sitting for 1 minute comfortably. There's no point pushing through so that you start to dislike this shape or have an adverse reaction to it. And worst case scenario, most of the things that we do cross-legged, you can do in a chair. So if you've got elderly relatives or you're working with an injury that just means cross legs is not accessible, just don't do it. Find an alternative. There's always an alternative. But I think crossing your legs and seated is one of actually the more challenging things we have to face when we're a beginner. So don't think that you're strange or weird or bad. It's just your body adapting to something that you haven't done. Most of us, some cultures I've noticed, people generally from like Southeast Asia, like Indians and people or Japanese, because they usually have much lower tables, they sit on the floor. Their bodies are more used to it. So they tend to not find it such a big shift. But most of us living in kind of Western society with, unfortunately, too many chairs and too many comfy, slouchy sofas just have lost some of the strength and muscularity of the back and have some tightness in the hips. So I would just say use props.
Brilliant advice. And in fact, would you say that people should persevere with trying cross-legged, or should they kneel? Or
yeah, I think being aware that there are many different ways that you can sit. Absolutely. Kneeling is a really nice way. Kneeling with props underneath the bum is a really nice way. I think it just really depends on what the purpose of that. Sometimes sitting cross-legged, the purpose is to stretch your outer hips. And so therefore, by doing it, you're doing it. Does that make sense? But I think always, if there's pain, don't persevere through pain because it's telling you something. But like I said, I think those little and often increments, like trying it for 30 seconds, then maybe trying it, building up to a minute, is slowly allowing your body to adapt, but just slowly without pushing it.
Brilliant. I think we're almost out of time now, but it's always such a pleasure to talk to you, Lucy. I should actually, I haven't said this, but I should let people know that when I did my teacher training final graduation exam, Lucy was the person on the panel. So Lucy actually practiced my class. So
and it was amazing. It was so brilliant. It was such an honor. And that's why I love having these conversations, because I think yoga is the best thing, and it's made my life infinitely better. And so I'm so excited about the fact that people are trying it. And I just say, if you're a beginner, just keep going, because the benefits that it can bring you are the benefits that it's brought my life are beyond anything in my wildest dreams I could have dreamt about in my first forays into being a beginner in yoga. Now I don't know. I genuinely don't know. I cannot conceive of a life without yoga. Like, it makes me feel so much better. It is like coping strategy, especially in times like this. It reminds me more than ever that what a gift it is to have been exposed to yoga, and what a gift, movement for modern life is, that even when we can't go into studios, it's there. There's so many amazing beginners resources on the site. So go and find them. And also, don't be afraid about reaching out to us. If you have questions, on any of my practices, always message me, and I'll always take time to write back, because that's the beauty of this resource, of that, you can have communication and ask questions and be interactive as well.
And do classes again and again and again. I mean, I think if you looked at my history on Movement for Modern Life, I think your 20-minute morning magic practice has probably been, I wouldn't like to say quite how many times but it's really nice revisiting a practice. And I think in the same way as we were saying, our bodies aren't the same every day. Even if you're redoing a class, I think some people worry about, I really like this. I've seen comments where people have said, I really like this class, but maybe I should find another one. And I'll just say, you don't need to. If you love a class, do it again.
Keep coming back to it. If it ain't broke, just go and keep doing it. Yeah, I think, and actually there's a lot to be said. I think one of my teachers, Max, said, in the beginning, as a beginner, we need repetition. Actually doing the same things over and over is how our body learns. So actually, I would say, definitely as a beginner, revisiting, those beginner classes and not trying to rush through it, I think is the way that actually you're going to evolve much quicker than if you just suddenly are trying to do a little bit of everything.
Yeah, and I would encourage non-beginners to try beginners classes again, because I think it's really interesting. And as I said, I sometimes actually now find beginners classes really challenging as well, because you're really going back to basics, thinking about your breath and your body and where you're placing things, and there's a lot going on that really helps you to get stronger.
And I also think they remind you of how sometimes, once we pass the beginner stage, we can get stuck in habits or autopilot. And actually, they really remind us of the beauty of that beginner's mind, of just being present moment to moment and meeting each thing as if it were brand new. And when you practice like that, it suddenly gets so juicy, I find, of like, wow, imagine doing Warrior 1 or Warrior 2 for the first time ever. And then suddenly it feels different because you're approaching it in this new way. So I think, yeah, there's such juiciness around staying with that beginner's curiosity and openness.
Yep. Kate says she agrees that Movement for Modern Life is a gift, and she's going to re-listen to this again. She says she's got her daughters bouncing around at the moment. So yoga's all about real life as well, though, isn't it?
I can relate to that. I came right on this call from my daughter bouncing around, and I will go straight back out. Probably her bouncing.
around. And Susanna says, thank you so much, Lucy. Hearing you and doing your classes is always inspiring and a joy. And I would echo that. I think to conclude, I'm going to say, yes, it always is inspiring. It always is a joy.
Well, thank you for having me. It's always a total pleasure to be involved, and yeah, just spreading yoga. What better thing to do?
And we're back next week at this
time. We are. Yeah.
So as part of the home yoga retreat, which in fact starts on next Monday, but we've got a sort of a prelude on Saturday as well. So you'll find all the details. But Lucy's in fact back next Tuesday at this time, and we're going to be delving into philosophy. A little bit more then, so which I'm really excited about.
Me too.
I get to chat to you and talk about philosophy and learn loads from you. So
and again, if you're a beginner, don't be afraid. It's going to be talked about in a very accessible, tangible, juicy, yummy way.
And it's a really nice thing to kind of feed into a yoga practice and help support a yoga practice as well, and taking it off the mat a little bit.
And I also think it often answers a lot of questions, because I think people do have a sense of like, oh, what is this ancient yogic thing, and having a sense of its history and it being more than just the physical postures. And I think actually it's really lovely to be given the opportunity to find out a bit more about that background. I think the curious beginner mind often quite wants to find out a bit more about the philosophy stuff.
Yeah, so brilliant. Thank you so much, Lucy.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for all your questions.
Yeah, and we'll see you all next week.
Yay, lots of love, everyone.